that, we're going to turn the floor straight over to Rashid. Rashid Duroseau is a teacher at Democracy Prep Charter Middle School. Take it away, Rashid.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Rashid. I actually moved out of the classroom earlier this year. I'm the Civics Program Director at Democracy Prep Public Schools. So I was really excited to have the opportunity to talk about some of the work that our network does in order to continue to prepare our scholars to live lives of active citizenship. Civics is really core to the work Democracy Prep does as an organization. It's explicitly focused on closing the civic opportunity gap with the same urgency that we're focused on closing the achievement and opportunity gaps in general. So the resource that I'm going to share today is I'm going to share two short resources. One is a lesson based on current events that's really rooted in ensuring that scholars understand how our government functions, because we understand that in order to empower the next generation of change makers, they need to have a clear understanding of how institutions in society work and what a citizen's role and power is in society. So this one specifically will focus on presidential primaries to give you a look at what it could look like in an online setting. And then I'm going to save the last couple minutes just to share a resource from Democracy Prep to ensure that scholars are also able to engage remotely with service projects. So there's a little database. So with that, I'm going to share my screen with you. Just a quick thumbs up if you can see a Google form right now. Wonderful. So this lesson, again, is based on presidential primaries. I'll walk you through the scholar view of it, and I'll talk about some of the features that are also built into it. So, of course, it starts with an aim just for the scholars, even though they're not physically in the classroom, to have a very clear picture of where the lesson is going to go, what they're going to be able to do by the end. Then you'll see just an activating prior knowledge. So scholars are asked to share what they know in general about presidential primaries. This is aimed towards middle and lower high school, and it could be modified for upper levels of high school as well. But as many of us know from being in the classroom, if you ask a scholar, what do you know, especially online, you might just get IDK, right? And so if that is the case, adding the other prompt to say if it's a new topic, write one fact that you've learned about presidential elections in general, just to ensure that they're constantly engaging with the material. The next section is a video viewing that the scholars are doing. This is a part of my work as Civics Program Director, is to design materials specifically for Democracy Prep schools' needs. So this video I created by taking a number of other videos, piecing them together, and then including text to guide scholars' viewing. So in this activity, scholars would watch the video in its entirety one time. They'd pay attention to the focus questions, and then after the first viewing, they would then respond to the post-viewing questions. To give you a picture of what that looks like, there's a number of videos. You'll notice a focus question at the top as scholars view the video so that they're really clear about what they should be looking for as they watch.
The Iowa caucus is like an election, but instead of voting in a voting booth, you stand with other people to be counted. We do things now.
What you'll notice afterward is that each question has a timestamp. So after scholars have viewed the initial video, they then can go back to the specific portion of the video that would allow them to then answer the questions that were posed to them. So there are four. They range from what is the presidential primary, how does it work, to explaining why strong performance in a presidential primary actually helps a nominee's chances. The next section is a check for understanding. So in this section, scholars are really applying some of their nonfiction and graphic interpretation skills. So for this one, for example, and in the event they can't see it, there's a larger link that they could click that shows a bigger version, but they're really just eliminating, using the graphic to eliminate incorrect answers or identify correct statements that really get at the root of them understanding that a primary election is very different from a general election. So in this question, they have the graphic and they're asked which statement is true. And the statement that's true here is that primary elections help political parties identify their nominees for the election. A misconception is that winning a primary would lead one to become the president, and we know that that's not the case. The next section also just uses a graphic from 2016's election to have scholars do a deeper dive and understand some of the nuances of presidential elections. And so looking at both Republican and Democratic primaries to get a sense of what is a delegate, how does it all play out on a kind of larger scale. So the two false statements here, I'll just indicate there for anyone who chooses to use the resource. The final piece is having them imagine that a classmate explained that they didn't understand how or what a primary election was and how it was different from a general election. So this is really the space where they would take the time to provide that level of explanation on a scholar level to really demonstrate their understanding instead of parroting something that they had heard previously. You'll also notice that there are point allocations for each of the questions. This is in case teachers also want to make sure that scholars are getting a concrete sense of how they're performing with the material. So for an open-ended question using a rubric of 3 points, scholars can really get a sense of, am I actually putting in the same level of effort that I would put in if I were in the classroom and interfacing with a teacher. The last section just gives scholars an option to really push the nonfiction skills. Newsela, for those of you who are not aware, or Newsela, is actually offering a free full membership to any teacher in any school that is interested for the rest of the 2019-2020 academic year. So we definitely took advantage of that. Those who don't know, it takes news from a variety of sources and then allows you to adjust the reading level based on wherever your scholars are. So scholars would select an article, they would indicate which article, and then they would explain what the central idea of that text was for whatever they read. So for example, if we were to look at Super Tuesday, this is what you would see. It's a little slow, so in the interest of time, I might come back to that. But at the very end, just leaving a space for questions for scholars to really get a clearer sense of what is a presidential primary, anything else that they may have wanted to ask. We're gonna give it one more shot, and then I will move to the final piece that I was really excited to share with you, the final resource from Democracy Prep. There we go. So this is what the Newsela looks like. It has the heading, and then you can adjust the reading level for your scholars. It goes all the way from just the adult level down to a lower elementary level. Just something for anyone who's interested to check out. And then finally, just the remote civics opportunities for students. This is from our Democracy Prep website. Something that you may want to visit is I've put together a database of different opportunities based on age group, whether it's adults who are interested in getting involved in helping out, or high schoolers, elementary schools, but here you'll find links, descriptions, organization names of about 30 different opportunities for people to get involved. And because it's really important to Democracy Prep that we continue to empower communities and empower citizens, there's also a link to vote.org's updates for voting and COVID-19. So you find your state, and then you can simply indicate whatever information you're seeking. With that, I would like to thank you all for the opportunity to share some of the things we're doing at Democracy Prep. And I'm really excited to answer questions and then hear about what some other institutions are doing to ensure our scholars are still empowered to make changes. Even though we're not physically together, we're still united in our commitment to our scholars and to building a brighter future.
Thank you so much. So we've got a few minutes, and it would be great to take some questions. Maybe Rashid, I would be happy to get started, because one of the things that I'd love to know a little more about, this list of opportunities for students looks fantastic. And I'm wondering how much that is, how much of a part of your curriculum those opportunities are.
During the regular school year, it's really important at Democracy Prep for us to ensure that our scholars are getting hands-on opportunities to bring about change. Our motto is work hard, go to college, change the world. But we understand that you don't have to be a college student or an adult to change the world. So we really want to make sure that they get opportunities throughout the school year, whether it's organizing a fundraiser, working at a food bank, whatever the case may be, we give them those hands-on experiences. And part of our core programming is what we call a day of service, where we actually cancel the academic schedule for a single day and send our scholars into the entire community, whether it's in New York, whether it's in Texas, whether it's in Las Vegas, New Jersey, Baton Rouge, and they go out, they work with local nonprofits, and then they just understand a little bit better how those organizations function. So this is just an extension of the work and the opportunities that we would love to have offered our scholars in person, but we know that they're still eager to do good, even if they're not able to physically go to certain sites. And I did see a question about whether there's a bias towards one party or other in the chat. And I'll just quickly say that there's no bias. Really, it's about building community members who are prepared and excited to lift up the people around them. Whether it's red or blue, that's immaterial to us. That's not what we're really focused on. What we're really focused on is that no matter which side you choose to embrace, you understand how our government functions, and you understand your role and your power as a citizen to bring about change, or to build a coalition of people who want to bring about change. But we're completely nonpartisan.
Nice. Lisa, you have a question.
Yes. First, I'm impressed by all that you built into that. That was just a Google form, and wow, I have to go play with that. I get something that's troubling us a lot in trying to figure out how to structure work and have them working independently is, especially if it's something that leans more toward an assessment, to just make sure that they're truly assimilating information material that we're covering. And that is simply, while I'm doing this on my computer, I'm on my phone with somebody else and they're helping me answer things. And I wondered if you have built in, kind of an honor system, and if anybody, are you talking a lot more with your students about that kind of issue? Is that concern impacting the decisions you're making about the kind of tasks you're giving them?
That's a really interesting question. I'll take a step back and say that, again, in my current role in administration, I'm one level removed from the scholars, so that's not something I can directly address for this time, but I do have 10 years of classroom experience, and I have been using remote learning opportunities in the past. And what I've found is that there is a level of effort that goes into the work, especially a familiarity with where your scholars were, that is really clear when the work is not coming from the scholar, it's actually someone who's helping them out, or where they're looking up certain pieces. I think it's a combination of paying careful attention to the work that our scholars have done previously and comparing whatever work it is currently, but it's also building in certain core skills in terms of their written responses. So at Democracy Prep, we use the RACER rubric, which is restate, answer the question, cite evidence, and we do that twice. And it's very clear to see, especially when there are a limited number of texts. So I know precisely if I give you one article and I have a quote from externally, then we can kind of immediately say, okay, there may be an honor code question here. But in my time, I haven't really encountered scholars doing that, but I think the remote learning setting and landscape that we're in now definitely puts us in a space where we have to be prepared for that. I'm sorry that's not as comprehensive an answer as I would have liked.
So we have two more questions, but I'd like to hold those, if we could, for our later conversation and bring in our second presenter. And I'd like to turn the floor over to Sari Rosenberg, who teaches at the High School for Environmental Studies.
Hi, everybody. So I'm not going to share my screen at all. I don't really have, I can direct you to some places where I have clips of what I'm about to talk about later. So just a little bit about me. I've been teaching, this will be
I think that's my cue. I just want to say that.
What up? Oh.
I think it's okay.
Okay, I'm like turning into an SNL skit. So I've been teaching for nearly 18 years. This will be my 18th year at the same school, the High School for Environmental Studies. Definitely a different year this year. And so I've been teaching, I usually teach the US History Regions course, and I'm currently teaching AP US History. I'm also teaching a internship class this year, so that's not happening anymore. And that's where, and my school's built around education around sustainability. So we are placing a lot of the students in internships around, in places around the city related to the environment and sustainability. but that's obviously on hold right now. So today I just want to talk about, so yes, I teach an AP US history course, and we're pretty much hemmed into the, I'm sure other people teach AP classes in this group. We're hemmed into a certain curriculum, but like everyone here as well, I'm sure, I think it's really important. You know, people always say now more than ever, but I think it's always been really important to keep our students civically engaged. And the way that I do it, I mean, ostensibly, I'm not doing it every day because I have to follow this curriculum, but the way that I believe is a really great way to build in civics education is I've always been passionate about making sure that my students had a working, comfortable knowledge about current events, and understanding the social, political, and economic landscape, climate of our world. And it usually ends up being a pretty easy hook for students as well, because they always kind of hear little tidbits in the news or from their family and friends and have questions. So I feel like the way that I sneak in civics a lot is working in the synthesis part of the course, bringing up current events and relating it to 1800, because it's actually a lot easier than we realize. So in terms of remote learning, how am I doing that? Well, there is this May 15th, speaking of online cheating, there's an open notes AP exam for every course. For US history, it's a 45, I don't know if anyone else teaches AP US history in the group, but it's just quickly, it's a 45-minute DBQ essay with 5 documents, period. That's it. I won't waste the time talking about my thoughts about that. So, but it's been my focus as of last week to get the students prepared for this. But leading up to this, I was in the middle of my civil rights unit, and that's actually not going to be on the exam. And I felt really passionate about continuing that, finishing that unit before launching into test prep mode. And so what I did for the couple of weeks before I started doing test prep was I brought in a couple of guest speakers to talk about their work and connect civics to what we were learning about, like current day civics. So one speaker I brought in, this was through Instagram Live, because that just kind of worked out for everyone. And then I recorded it for students who could not attend or who did not have Instagram. I brought in, this was because students were asking me about the criminal justice system and how it was related to the COVID-19 crisis. They were seeing tidbits in the news about how incarcerated people were not being released, and they had questions around that and were feeling very angry about it, I think rightfully so. And so a friend of mine is Eliza Orland. She's a public defender, and she happens to be running for Manhattan district attorney. That wasn't the reason why she showed up, though, because that's illegal to campaign using the DOE. But I talked to her about my students' questions, and she volunteered because I found that a lot of people are a little more free lately, and it's a lot easier to pop up in someone's Zoom class or Instagram Live than show up in their classroom in the middle of the day. So I asked her if she wouldn't mind joining in and talking about that issue, because that's something that she's been working on as a public defender. And she said yes. So she spent an hour with my students vis-a-vis Instagram Live, talking about the facts, explaining to them what was going on, explaining to them why certain people are in prison, and why she at least believed they should be let out of prison, because they were going to be like dying in prison because of COVID-19 exposure. And students were able to, because kids are always on Instagram, they know how to use it better than me. They were asking her questions via the chat, and it worked out great. So that was my first guest. I'm just looking at the time. And the other guest I can talk about is, once we transitioned over to Zoom, now we're on Google Meet, but that's a different conversation. I was doing my final lesson for my civil rights unit before I had to transition into boring test prep. And I brought in a professor, he's at St. Thomas University in Minneapolis. His name's Dr. Uhuru Williams. He's an expert in, he's amazing. He's on History Channel, but I'm mostly familiar with his work around the Black Lives Matter movement and Black Panthers. So I asked if he wouldn't mind joining in to talk about the Black Panther Party and the Black Power movement, and connect it to the Black Lives Matter current day movement. And he did that with the students. And that was awesome because I was able to bring in I'm not a college professor. I just pretend to be in the AP course, but I was able to bring in an actual college professor into my Zoom class who was involved, who's an expert in the Black Panther Party. He actually helped edit a book on the party, and he talked about it. And what we did, it was a little wonky, but a little weird, but I played clips from Eyes on the Prize, which I found on YouTube because PBS never released it. But you actually can get them from Teaching Tolerance, I think, hosts it. I forget which one I used. And I played clips, and then I would pause it and say, kind of like, it was what I always wished to happen, to have a scholar in the room with me. I said, hey, Dr. Williams, can you tell us a little bit about this decision of Stokely Carmichael's to drop the phrase black power at this particular moment in the march? And then he just took it away. And it was really cool. So that's the way I've brought in civics. It's not like directly because I'm not teaching a government and civics class right now, but the next course that students will take is AP government, hopefully next year. So I do feel like it is my obligation, not just because I think that we need these kids to be civically engaged and have a working knowledge of all of this information, but also I want as many as possible to take AP government. So I want to tantalize them a bit by bringing up all this content now. So that's how I'm doing it. I can share that video, the interview with Eliza Orland. I found a way to get it on YouTube. It was pretty cool. And I can also share my Zoom class with Dr. Williams. I put that on YouTube as well. So I can share that later.
Excellent, thank you. So let's open the floor to questions for Sari.
Yeah, Facing History, that was it. That was the one I used.
Yeah, so Amber is posting here on the chat that Facing History hosts the Eyes on the Prize series.
Yes, that's the actual platform that I use.
Yeah, and I think it's open now for everyone, regardless of whether or not you're facing history school or not, due to the pandemic, I think.
Yeah, it is. You just have to say, I said that I was a student, and then it let me proceed to the videos.
And now the whole library is open.
It's awesome.
Great. And you have a question here as well, Amber.
Everything you said sounds really cool.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in the Instagram live experience. So I gather you have an Instagram account.
Yeah, so the way
you set it up and then kids came to watch it and then you recorded it. Can you talk about that?
That was the one feature that Instagram needs to improve is I did it by recording the screen. Oh God, it was actually a nightmare. So basically,
did you do that on Google? Like you recorded it
on my screen, because basically the way Instagram Live works is you can post it, but it only stays on your account for 24 hours. And so I tried to record, it was like 40 minutes. And so what I did was I recorded it in pieces because it kept stopping. And then I figured out how to use iMovie and I linked it together that way. I've never used iMovie before, but I just did it. And in terms of like Instagram, so I was one of the first teachers at my school I have my own personal Instagram, but I set up a one with my students last year. And I was using it more just to post like on this day in history. And I can't force my kids to follow me or even be on Instagram. But a lot of the teachers were like, I don't know about teachers having Instagram accounts. Now all the teachers at my school now have set up Instagram accounts because it's just another way to reach the kids. My advice is obviously a teacher asked me if he should follow students back. And I was like, no, I don't follow them back. Like former students, sure. But basically I decided to do that Instagram Live on my teacher account. And it's problematic in the sense that not every kid is on Instagram. And that's why I decided to record it. And that's why I learned iMovie, because I felt bad. I didn't want to leave any of the kids out of the experience. Yeah.
Cool.
Excellent. Other questions? I do think that we at the Academy are finding exactly the same experience as you're suggesting, Sari, about finding people very able and willing to join you on a digital chat. And so be brave in that regard, because I think it's a very it's an interesting moment where, because it can be done digitally, as you suggest, it can often be done in the course of 15 minutes between classes for a university professor. Rashid, you had a question.
Yeah, I just saw your question. So I put a pause on future guests until after the AP exam, because I'd rather just do guests and continue talking about more relevant issues. But they did sign up for the AP course, so I need to. They want to take the exam. I feel like it's my duty as a teacher. But I do want to bring in. I have a couple people in mind. One, I'm working with one scholar named Hugh Ryan on this Hidden Voices curriculum for the DOE they're doing a LGBTQ plus curriculum to go along with the K through 12 curriculum. And so my friend and I have been working with Hugh Ryan on some curriculum, and I asked if he would come in and talk about the AIDS crisis and like the 1960s Stonewall movement before that. And so I want him to come in. And you're right, I do think we can be a little more brave and bold right now, because I think that there are a lot of people feeling kind of helpless in the sense they want to help, and there aren't ways, unless have a medical degree or nursing degree, it's really hard to help directly. But I do find that just like hit people up on Instagram even. I mean, that it's been successful for me, and it's not like I have a ton of followers, but just reach out to people, because I do think that people want to help, and if lending their knowledge and expertise with our students, scholars right now, I think you'd be surprised as to how many people would be willing to do that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, with that, let's turn to our third presenter, Carine Gibert, who teaches at the Lycée Français de New York. And Carine has been having a little technical difficulty, so I hope we'll be able to keep her with us.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think you're okay. Let me just check. Okay, just signed back in. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Sorry about that. I seem to be dropping in and out of my audio, so at some point, if it gets too difficult to hear, then I will just shut my video off and see if that helps a little bit. So I teach governance at the Lycée Français. So we look at it much more from an international perspective. And one of the things that I wanted to share today was how we are sort of tackling the question of nationalism and multilateralism. It is a international options class. So some of you may be familiar with the IB, and this is the OIB. So it's l'option internationale du baccalauréat. So it's similar to an AP class in that it's an advanced placement class, and students do get college credit for the class. And the class is focused on this question of sovereignty. So the question of sovereignty of a nation state is at the heart of some of our discussions. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just so that you have some visual to follow along with. Can everybody see my screen okay? Okay, so the question says, or sort of the overview is world economic governance, but we really start to break it down and actually ask the question, world governance, what does that look like? And this has been a really wonderful opportunity to talk about that, because one of the three institutions from a historical standpoint that we look at is the United Nations. So we look at the creation of the IMF, the World Bank, and the United Nations post-World War II and ask the question, what is the role of the nation state today? and how does the nation state sort of keep its sovereignty or lose its sovereignty as world governance becomes more relevant economically. But now, of course, with the World Health Organization, we've had a lot of really fantastic conversations on entities within the United Nations that are part of this multilateral effort. So the pedagogical objectives of, let me just make sure that I can move through that, of the theme, we do UBDs, so we use understanding by design. So we work our way backwards from, what are the pedagogical objectives that we'd like students to be able to come away with. It is, the exam is actually a essay exam, but it's also a 20-minute conversation one-on-one with your teacher. So we assess them at the end of the year where we have 20 minutes with each student and one-on-one conversation. It takes a very long time. The exam is over the course of a week, but it really gives us an opportunity to have, in a way, a much more casual conversation with the student to see what some of the things are that they've been able to take away. So the purpose of studying the scales of levels of governance is to look at the evolution of political power. So what is the sort of the relationship of a nation to a larger entity such as the World Health Organization, and what kinds of things does it have sovereignty on, and what kinds of things has it given up its sovereignty in order to be essentially in unity with these larger institutions that are making decisions. So we start with the nation state. We use France because it is the lycée français, so that's the state that we use. But the analytical questions look at, what is a nation state? What is the role of the nation state? How this role has changed? And what are the consequences of these changes on the idea of a nation? And students have been very engaged in this question, much more so than we've seen in past years, because they're seeing the limitations of a nation under the conditions of a pandemic. They're seeing also how certain leaders making decisions individually and not necessarily in this sort of international collaborative effort is raising questions of nationalism. This is particularly true in Europe, but of course relevant in the United States as well. And so we have this conversation, and we look similarly towards experts to talk about the role of nationalism and multilateral cooperation during this time. So then we move to Europe, because Europe is sort of the next level for France. So it's nation at the center, the continental scale, which is the European scale, and then the world economic scale as a third layer. And we just, I just inserted this so that you can see, we sort of talk about what are the roles of the heads of state. So what are the roles of the heads of countries that are part of the European Union, but how do they lose their sovereignty part of Europe? And we talk about the system. It's part of the curriculum, so similar to an AP course, this is also something that they need to walk away with understanding what is Europe, which I realize is probably less relevant maybe for some of you in this context, but the question of nationalism versus multilateralism is so fascinating. And the conversation that students have had on fears around, does this mean borders are going to close? Does this mean international cooperation is going to end? Really have come up, and the investment of the students has been inspiring in terms of looking at international cooperation. So the analytical continental questions are really focused on Europe, so I won't spend time on those, but just to say that, we do look at it from a historical perspective. How have nations entered Europe, and in what moments have they lost some sovereignty, before moving to then the world scale. And then we have some readings and some interviews. So Jeffrey Sachs, who I'm sure many of you know, who heads up the Earth Institute, he spoke at our school and intervened at a couple of our classes last year. And then he also wrote lots of books, one of them, The Age of Sustainable Development, which we use in our class. And so one of the things that we asked them to look at is this interview. So he is in conversation in this interview, it's about 7 minutes long, with a expert on some of these questions, and he basically argues for why multilateralism is going to be potentially at risk? What are the conversations that are going to come up that may challenge multilateralism, because people are thinking much more on how can we close borders, or how can we guarantee safety for our people, given that, of course, this pandemic is an international concern, but also a result of the interconnectedness of our economies. So that's one of the resources that we asked them to look at. And then the second one is an article that is also highlighting, again, the importance of multilateralism. And then we asked students to find arguments from sources that they have heard either on Instagram, on Facebook, or any of their social media feeds that are putting some of these international efforts at risk. We certainly, come from the perspective of hoping that students are looking at why international cooperation is so essential. So there is some bias in that sense. We do, put forward the idea, because it's an international school, it's an international community, the students come from so many different countries. And we ask them to find examples that are challenging multilateralism and how nationalism in Europe is essentially in certain moments being reinforced in order to deal with the pandemic and questions of sort of citizen safety. So the further slides are just looking at some of the terminology. So defining world economic governance, what does that mean for students? And then we also look at multiple actors. So who are the actors in world economic governance? So we talk about the fact that it's not just governments, but it's also private entities. We talk about transnational corporations. So we look at actors in global economic governance, who they are, when did they come up. Prime examples are the G20, the World Trade Organization. So we really look at who are the players in world economic governance that are not only governments and states, but also let's say, governing institutions that don't directly tie to national governments. We asked them at the end to summarize institutions that have been relevant and look briefly at a timeline. So we look at some of the early institutions post-World War II, some of the institutions in the 70s. They take a class called Sciences économiques et sociales, which asks them to look at the economic cooperations between certain countries that have been considered, part of the industrialized G7, and then BRICS and other organizations that have been in response to that, looking at the inequities and sort of marginalized economies. So the question really comes back to this comparison between how nation states are reorienting themselves in this current global issue.
Wonderful, thank you. So let's open the floor to your questions and thoughts. I'm wondering, Carine, if you can talk a little bit about how your presentation of this material differs in this online format as opposed to how you might have done it in a typical classroom setting.
So that's certainly been something where we, and Rashid, I was thinking of that when you were sharing, we as a school, because of the sort of traditional ways in which the French system sometimes runs their classrooms, that's been one of the big questions in the way that we are able to translate some of the content. What we've found is that a lot of the students, the way that they've engaged with the material has been through audio recordings, because so many of their exams are oral exams, these conversations. So we are actually having one-on-ones, which of course is not something that is necessarily sustainable for a long period of time, but with our seniors, we're having one-on-ones with them because that's actually what the exam format is now going to look like. And so for a lot of the assignments, we're asking them to send in audio recordings and sort of audio responses to some of the questions so that we can give them feedback on their syntax, their pausing, their articulation, a lot of the feedback that we give them when they're preparing for their oral exams to begin with.
Interesting. Excellent. Well, I am wondering, I've got a question for you all. Since we're a relatively small group, and I know there were some questions that came up early on, would you like to go into small groups, or would you like to stay in this larger group so we can begin to talk a little bit more about these presentations, about what they suggest, about how we might continue to develop each of your approaches to civics in your classrooms? Any preferences?
Well, I have some questions for the other presenters, so part of me feels like it'd be nice to stay in the full group, but I'm open.
I agree. I think it would be strong for us to stay as a group since we're fairly small.
Excellent. Okay, that's great. Good. Then I'd like to open the floor up for questions to any of our presenters.
So can I start and ask a question to another presenter?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, great, thank you. So Rashid, I had a question in terms of, at the beginning you were talking about that now this remaining civically engaged has been one of the priorities. And I know you said you're no longer in the classroom, but are you seeing students sort of mobilize their civic engagement because they're staying home and they have a little bit maybe more space to think about implications on their lives directly?
I think that's a really wonderful question. And I will say that right now we're collecting a lot of information. So just to give a picture, there are 22 schools, and then from my position, I'm communicating with individuals working in each of the schools. So not enough of the information has yet gotten to a point where I can give you a really clear, like, this is what they're doing in these regions. But what I can say is that a lot of teachers are highly motivated to tie this into the work that they're doing. So we have one teacher who's already doing an economics of the COVID-19 pandemic and how is it shaping global markets. And the scholars seem very engaged with the material. And we definitely see that because they're constantly Zooming and using social media. They have a very strong response on social media. So I will say, from what I have seen, there has been a lot, but I'm still in the process of finding ways to collect that data a little bit more rapidly so that we can answer questions like that.
Right.
But I actually had a question for you as well. I'm curious to hear about the logistics of collecting the audio responses from scholars, because I feel like there's a lot of power just for any of our students in any kind of age group where it's, oh, I see someone said FlipGrid. Is that what you're using as well?
No, for now, we are actually creating larger collections where they're uploading their voice memos, because everybody, well, not everybody, but most students have a phone. And so they're recording on their voice memos, and then we're creating in an iMovie, actually, a situation where people can then insert the different audios, so that once students have been given some feedback and they feel comfortable with it, they can listen to each other's audios as well. Because the idea is that we're trying to figure out ways in which students won't just hear from each other in Zoom, but will hear from each other's assignments, so that they can reflect back on, students that are bringing up, well, I found this particular activist who's working towards multilateralism, and this is my, my take on that. So we're putting snippets a little bit together, but it's a process that we're in right now. So in a similar way, I haven't quite got that collection yet of all the students together.
I see.
Great. Seth, I wonder if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, that's why I put my in the chat. So FlipGrid is like a free app. So I do a lot of technology in my school, and FlipGrid, it allows you to create classrooms and post questions. And I don't know if there's a time limit on like student submission, but students can do it on their computer or even on their phone. And it's just like, instead of typing their responses, you're doing a short recording, and then it sort of collects all the responses in like a grid.
Wow. Okay, great.
And so therefore, like, even in your idea, having students comment, you can, I think, like, in the settings of it, make it so like the posts are public and students can watch each other and comment on the other videos like as well.
And Seth, can you say just a little bit about how you're using FlipGrid right now?
I personally don't use it a lot. And just, I think I'm going to use it for an assessment for my freshmen who struggle with writing, letting them just talk through the response, and just letting them get that, especially them being stuck at home. And I think that's really, and then with my seniors, I sort of push them to type because they need to type for college, but especially for like English learners and kids with IEPs, it's like a really good tool for short responses, especially like a kid might not have a platform to sit down and like type in their home to like write out a response, but they can record it on their phone on their couch relatively easily.
And you raised the question of English language learners, and Gay, you had posed that question a little bit earlier, and I think this is one really wonderful answer to that. And maybe we can come back to your question in a few minutes, Gay. Amber, I'd like to ask you to jump in.
So a couple of things. Yeah, I highly recommend FlipGrid as well. I myself have not used it in my class, but I'm going to. I've been sitting in on like what the 6th grade at my school is doing, and they're using it for independent reading assessments. So kids are doing mini book talks and like commenting each other's book talks, and they've had a lot of success with that. So I'm excited to do that. And you can set a time limit too, which I think is really important because we have so much to grade. You can make a 30-second limit, a 1-minute limit. And you set up a free account. So I think that's also cool. It's free. I was gonna ask Rashid before, if you could talk a little bit about the context of how civics happens in your school, if it is a class, if students are were meeting before all this and are still meeting in individual blocks, and just if you could talk about like how that works logistically. And then the final thing I'll say is like, I really want to plug Google Forms. Google Forms is awesome because you can make forms, and your forms are really cool, but you can embed videos. And then for me, because I have 100 students, it's a really good thing to do because you can create a spreadsheet.
Right.
So you can sort that spreadsheet by timestamp, by name, by block, if that's what you're doing, and you can just quickly use it to see what kids know. I've been using it a lot as an exit ticket, kind of, posting videos and just having them answer these questions. So I love Google Forms for that. And then the last thing I'll say is that there's a lot of videos that I have been watching about how to prevent cheating on online assessments. So I'd be happy, like, as a longer conversation if people want to like talk about that. I myself have not given one, but there are ways that you can do all kinds of things to make it so that kids can only look at one screen. It's a little bit more complicated with phones, but there's things that you can do, and I think there will be more around that, like the longer this goes on.
Excellent. Rashid, do you want to speak to the context?
I want to speak to all three things you said, Amber. First, I think just kind of from this nerdy perspective, it's interesting when we think about the online cheating, at what point you even want to initiate that conversation. Because I feel like right now our scholars, for the most part, are existing in a space, at least I'm thinking also from the mindset of a middle school teacher, like many of them maybe have not thought to get there yet. And I wonder at what point you introduce a policy or you introduce, measures to prevent it, and that actually gets something, well, what could I do? Like, how could I actually move in the direction of something a little bit more creative with academic integrity, for lack of a better way of saying it. Two, I agree with you wholeheartedly. So I was a 6th grade history teacher for 10 years, and that is definitely something that Google Forms has just changed the game. I did it as exit tickets. I did it for scholars who were sick. I would upload the same lesson. I think there's so much power in it. It's I think a matter of creatively finding ways to take screenshots of certain pages that you've written or retyping certain parts of the lesson. So I would say like there's a little bit more work on the front end for anyone else who's thinking of adopting it. But I think once you get there, it's so powerful and you can collect so much data. And I think scholar investment actually increases tremendously because when you think about it, you give them a graded paper, they put it in front of you, you have 100 students like I did, then it takes maybe a day or 2 days, depending on how in-depth the work is, to get it back to them.
Right.
On Google Forms, they spend 20 minutes, they can answer 30 multiple choice questions and get an instant score and then want to redo it. I can't tell you how many emails I used to get or like texts from students on the work phone like, hi, I got a 16 out of 25. Can I redo it to bring my grade up? So I think the data, we think about it on the educator's perspective, but for the kids too, having access to that data constantly is really inspiring and motivating. To your question about our civics program, and I'm going to step back because I know I'm talking a lot, so I'll quiet after this, but civics is really woven into who we are and what we do. Democracy Prep was founded way back in 2006. In terms of charter years, I know that's a long time, but really the explicit mission is to educate responsible citizen scholars here. And that means that there's time built into advisory where our scholars are discussing current events. And I've produced a lot of videos and I'm happy to share with anyone interested, whether that's through Heritage Months or just something major happens in the community. So advisory time, it's built into our curriculum right now, our strategic plan, which I mentioned kind of prior to this talk. In our strategic plan, we're building out a very explicit curriculum. So right now it's more, there are pieces built into what we do in our community time. And then there are other components that are built into certain curricular pieces, like our seniors have a Change the World capstone project, where they actually spend the entire year researching a social issue as they take a sociology of change course. And that's allowing them to really understand not only what is my place in the world, how can I bring about change, but what are other structures that exist in society that allow me to be a better activist. I'm happy to talk more, any other questions outside of this initial discussion.
Excellent, thank you. So I wonder if we only have a few minutes left, and so I'd actually like to open the floor to ask any of you, either to raise another question, or alternatively to share with us something that hasn't come up yet today, that has been either a practice or a resource that you have found to be very useful.
Well, I'll say something. I'm a total interloper here. I teach English, but I love history and I love civics, and that's why I'm here. I want to make a comment. I think it was to Sari who talked about calling people. I used to be a journalist, and I found that if you call people on the phone, particularly if they're not famous, and if you call them on the phone, they're usually so flattered that you think they're an expert on something that they'll say yes. In particular, I was writing a book and I read about some dude out in Nebraska who was a names expert, and I called him at home. It's so easy to find people. This guy, eventually I just had to hang up on him. It was 2 hours later. It was very interesting, but he was shocked that anybody cared. And his name was mentioned in like the bottom of the Wall Street Journal article. So I think there are lots of people out there, even when we're not in the coronavirus, particularly what we're learning is how we can use Zoom. If somebody lives in San Diego, California, and you're in New York City, I happen to be in Baltimore right now. I'm in this from Baltimore. You can get them involved in your classroom. You don't have to fly them in. You don't have to do any of that kind of stuff. And I just find that people, anytime you flatter them, they're willing to do about anything for you.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Maria.
So I have a question for others who have talked. I teach a course, a senior elective on the mass incarceration crisis in America, and I also get, I mean, half my class is speakers, and I find if you send them your syllabus, they're so excited that kids are talking about big ideas and whatever. So this year I really wanted to, you know, it's an explicitly a social justice course, and you know, you can't come out of that class thinking mass incarceration is a good thing. So, but I wanted to have a service component to it. And this year I tried that. It was okay. It ended up being kind of charity work, which is not bad, but not really part of my larger agenda. And I'm wondering if anyone else, your capstone program sounds really interesting, Rashid. I have a semester-long class. I'm curious if people have been able to successfully marry civics and actual social justice engagement successfully in their classroom.
I can talk a little bit about that. It's not necessarily in my classroom. I'm an 8th grade teacher. I do a whole first semester on civics and a whole second semester on history of the US and thematically. But I also run a student activism group. And what I have found is that because there are just so many issues that have come up as a result of this, issues that we all know were issues before, it's been really cool to make like a sheet of contact information and different ways that students can respond. So a couple of my kids are really invested in rent cancellation right now. And so it was really cool to just give them a script and different ways that they could tweet at the governor or tweet at these specific state assembly people. And with mass incarceration, you know, there's so much happening right now just around the fact that, as you know, inmates are still being held and the conditions in which they're in. So I could just imagine a situation where you just create a menu of different people that kids could tweet at, or, you know, any number of things, make like a TikTok video and send it. But a couple of my students have reached out and told me that like just sending an email to the governor every day about rent cancellation made them feel like they were doing something.
Oh, I love that. Well, and actually that seems a really happy note to end on, because one of the things that I hope we can all leave this with is the fact that we're so surrounded by these big issues of COVID and the upcoming presidential election, that hopefully students will be motivated to do exactly the kinds of things that Amber is talking about. So I would like us to thank our 3 presenters, so Rashid and Sari and Carine, and to thank all of you for being here. This has been a really wonderful conversation, and I hope to see you all again very soon.